Hi folks, welcome to Some of Each, episode 3. Some of Each, in which I read you some fiction, some poetry, and some children's lit on a theme, and tonight's theme is the origin of species. So I have on my moth dress, which my sister Tess likes to call my Silence of the Lambs dress because it's covered with moths, but tonight it is my Darwin dress because it's covered with moths. So, welcome, and I'm going to start right off with some fiction. So tonight I'm going to read to you from Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer, which takes place in southern Appalachia. There's a whole host of characters learning to live with each other and the land and in relationship to the land, and I'm just going to read you a little bit from chapter 2. But first I have to show you the amazing end papers on this book. They're absolutely gorgeous, all these moths. So you have to see that. Okay, so Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer. And this is from chapter 2, which is called Moth Love. Lusa was alone, curled in an armchair and reading furtively, the only way a farmer's wife may read, it turns out, when the power of a fragrance stopped all her thoughts. In the 11th hour of the 9th day of May, for one single indelible instant that would change everything, she was lifted out of her life. She closed her eyes, turning her face to the open window and breathing deeply. Honeysuckle. Lusa shut the book on her index finger. Charles Darwin on moths. That was what she'd been lost in. A description of a virgin Saturnia carpini whose scent males flocked to, till they covered her cage, with several dozen even crawling down Mr. Darwin's chimney to find her. Piles of Lusa's books on the floor were shoved halfway out of sight behind this old overstuffed chair, the only spot in the house she had claimed as her own. When she first moved in, she'd dragged this chair, a strange thing, upholstered in antique green brocade, across the big bedroom to the tall south-facing window for the light. Now she leaned forward in her seat and moved her head a little to see out through the dusty screen. Far away, at the opposite edge of the hayfield, her eye caught on Cole's white t-shirt, and then made out the rest of him there, the forward arching line of his body. He was leaning out from the tractor seat, breaking off a branch of honeysuckle that had climbed into the cedary fence row high enough to overhang the edge of the field. Maybe that plume of honeysuckle was just in his way, or maybe he was breaking it off to bring back to Lusa. She liked to have a fresh spray in a jar above the kitchen sink. Survival here would be possible only if she could fill the air with scent and dispatch the stern female ghosts in that kitchen with the sweetness of an unabashed blooming weed. Cole was nearly a quarter of a mile away across the bottom field, tilling the ground where there'd soon be set tobacco. It seemed unbelievable that his disturbance of the branch could release a burst of scent that would reach her here at the house, but the breeze was gentle and coming from exactly the right direction. People in Appalachia insisted that the mountains breathed, and it was true. The steep hollow behind the farmhouse took up one long, slow inhalation every morning and let it back down through their open windows and across the fields throughout evening, just one full, deep breath each day. When Lusa first visited Cole here, she'd listened to talk of mountains breathing with a tolerant smile. She had some respect for the poetry of country people's language, if not for the veracity of their perceptions. Mountains breathe, and a snake won't die till the sun goes down, even if you chop off its head. If a snapping turtle gets hold of you, he won't let go till it thunders. But when she married Cole and moved her life into this house, the inhalations of Zebulon Mountain touched her face all morning, and finally she understood. She learned to tell time with her skin, as morning turned to afternoon, and the mountain's breath began to bear gently on the back of her neck. By early evening, it was insistent as a lover's sigh, sweetened by the damp woods, cooling her nape and shoulders whenever she paused her work in the kitchen to lift her sweat-damp curls off her neck. She had come to think of Zebulon as another man in her life, larger and steadier than any other companion she had known. But now there was her husband across the field, breaking off the honeysuckle branch to bring back to her. She was sure of it, for he tucked it between his thigh and the padded seat of the kubota. Its cloud of white flowers trembled as he bounced across the plowed field, steering the tractor with both hands. His work on the lower side was nearly done. When he returned to the house for his late morning coffee and dinner, as she was learning to call the midday meal, she would put the honeysuckle branch in water. Maybe they could talk then. Maybe she would put soup and bread on the table and eat her bitter words from earlier this morning. They argued nearly every day, but today had already been one of their worst. This morning at breakfast, she'd nearly made up her mind to leave. This morning, he had wanted her to. They had used all the worst words they knew. She closed her eyes now and inhaled. She could have just let him laugh instead at her fondness for this weedy vine that farmers hated to see in their fence rows. This week's gardening column in the paper was devoted to the elimination of honeysuckle. That had been the jumping-off point for their argument. "Be vigilant. The project will require repeated applications of a stout chemical defoliant," she'd read aloud, in her version of a stupid, exaggerated mountain burr that she knew would annoy Cole. But how could she help herself? It was the county extension agent who wrote this awful column called Gardening in Eden, whose main concern week after week was with murdering things. It stirred up her impatience with these people who seemed determined to exterminate every living thing in sight. Grubbing out wild roses, shooting blue jays out of cherry trees, knocking phoebe nests out of the porch eaves to keep the fledglings from messing on the stairs. These were the pastimes of Zebulon County, reliable as the rituals of spring cleaning. And he had said, "You're making fun of Zebulon County, you're making fun of me, Lusa." "This I need to be told?" she'd snapped, as if, sitting in this kitchen where she felt the disapproving presence of his dead mother, she could forget where he'd grown up. Cole was the youngest of 6 children, with 5 sisters who traveled no farther than the bottom of the hollow, where Dad Widner had deeded each daughter an acre on which to build a house when she married, meanwhile saving back the remainder of the 60-acre farm for his only son, Cole. The family cemetery was up behind the orchard. The Widener's destiny was to occupy this same plot of land for their lives and eternity, evidently. To them, the word town meant Egg Fork, a nearby hamlet of a few thousand souls, 9 churches, and a Kroger's. Whereas Lusa was a dire outsider from the other side of the mountains, from Lexington, a place in the preposterous distance. And now she was marooned behind 5 sisters-in-law who flanked her gravel right-of-way to the mailbox. Silently then, after snapping at him, she'd watched Cole eat his breakfast for a while before slapping down the offending newspaper and getting up to face her work, stepping out the kitchen door to receive yesterday's milk from the cool back porch. She was still in her slippers and seersucker nightshirt at that point. They hadn't been out of bed for an hour yet, and the fog was still lifting above the creek. An Io moth rested on the screen, her second favorite moth, whose surprising underwings were the same pinkish gold as her hair. Her favorite would always be Actius luna, ethereal green ghost of the upper forests. "Worn out from your big night of love," she scolded. "That's what you get." But of course he'd had no choice. All the giant silkworm family, the Ios and Lunas she admired, did their eating as caterpillars, and as adult moths had no mouths. What mute romantic extravagance, Lusa thought. A starving creature, racing with death to scour the night for his mate. She picked up the milk and handled it carefully, noting that it was nicely set, ready to separate. There wasn't but a gallon. They kept only 1 milk cow for the homemade butter and cream Cole liked, and milked her only in the evenings now. Lusa had shocked everyone with her proposal of eliminating the inconvenient 4 a.m. milking by putting up the cow with her calf in the barn overnight. She could even pasture mother and calf together and skip milking altogether if she needed to drive to Lexington for a weekend. Did it take a scientist to think of this? On days when Lusa wanted milk, they simply pushed the calf into the pasture separate from his mother so her udder would be full by evening. Cole's sisters disapproved of this easy arrangement, but Lusa felt smug. If they'd spent their girlhoods as slaves to the twice-daily milkings, that was not Lusa's problem. She had her own ways of doing a thing. She'd neatly mastered the domestic side of farming in less than a year, and Cole loved her cooking more than he'd loved his mother's. Now, as she stood at the sink, dipping the skimmer and watching the cream flow smoothly over the rim in a stream so thin it was nearly green, she had an inspiration. Fat bouquets of Savoy spinach stood ready for picking in her back door garden. Sautéed in butter with sliced mushrooms, a bay leaf, and this cream, they'd make for a fragrant, sensuous soup Cole would love. She could have it ready by noon when he came in for his dinner. She would concentrate on soup then, and try to let this argument go by. But Cole wouldn't do it. "Why don't you write the garden column for the newspaper, Lusa?" he goaded her from the breakfast table. "Think of all you could teach us sorry-ass bumpkins." "Cole, I have to concentrate on what I'm doing here. Do we have to fight?" "No, dear, I'm just sorry," he said, not sorry at all, "that I'm not from someplace fancy where people keep their dogs in the house and their gardens in window boxes." "Will you ever let it go? Lexington's not fancy. People there just have more to read and write than killing the honeysuckle in their hedgerows." "They needn't to bother. They don't have hedgerows. Every city yard I ever saw ended in the flat-killing mulch of the sidewalk." In many species of moths, Darwin had observed, the males prefer to inhabit more open territory, while the females cling under cover. She and Cole were a biological cliché. Was that it? A male and female following their separate natures? She glanced up from her waterfall of cream, wondering how to gentle down this thing between them. "A city person is only part of who I am," she said quietly. The lines they drew in argument were always wrong. He put her in a camp she hadn't chosen. How could he understand that she'd spent her whole sunburnt, freckled childhood trapped on lawn but longing for pasture? Spent it catching butterflies and moths, looking them up in her color-keyed book and touching all the pictures, coveting those that hid in wilder places. He cracked his knuckles and locked his hands behind his head. "Lusa, honey, you can take the girl out of the city, but you can't take the city out of the girl." "Shit," she said aloud, giving into pure irritation. Did he actually think he was clever? She'd mishandled the skimmer and dropped it too low right at the end, giving up most of the cream she'd just skimmed. Now it would take another half-day to separate again. She tossed the skimmer into the sink. "For this, I spent 20 years of my life in school." She turned to face him. "I'm sorry my education didn't prepare me to live here, where the two classes of animals are food and target practice." "You forgot bait," he drawled. "It's not funny, Cole. I'm so alone here. You have no idea." He picked up the paper and folded it back to the beef prices. So that would be that. Her loneliness was her own problem, and she knew it. The only people she ever talked to besides Cole were all in Lexington. When he suggested that she make friends here, she could picture only the doe-eyed, aggressively coiffed women she saw in Kroger's, and then she'd run to the phone to snipe about small-town life with Arlie and Hal, her former lab mates. But lately their support had run out on Lusa to the tune of embarrassing phone bills. "What's the problem exactly? You're not happy? So walk away. You've got feet. Get back here while you still can recover your grant money." She set herself to the task of sterilizing the milk utensils, trying to forget Arlie and Hal. Her former and present lives were so different that she couldn't even hold one in her mind as she lived the other. It embarrassed her to try. Instead, she soothed herself with an ancient litany. Actius Luna, Hyolophora Cecropia, Automeris Io. Luna, Cecropia, Io, the giant Saturnid moths, silken creatures that bore the names of gods into Zebulon's deep hollows and mountain slopes. Most people never knew what wings beat at their darkened windows while they slept. So that is part of chapter 2 from Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer. Highly recommend the entire book. So I'm going to read you a little bit of poetry now. I'm going to start with Vesper, Sparrows by Deborah Diggs, which is one of my favorite poetry books of all time. Deborah Diggs sadly died a few years back, but she's one of my favorite poets. So I'm going to read you 2 poems from this collection. One of them is one of my favorite poems of all time. This one is called Darwin's Finches. 1. My mother always called it a nest, the multicolored mass harvested from her 6 daughters' brushes, and handed it to one of us after she had shaped it, as we sat in front of the fire drying our hair. She said some birds steal anything, a strand of spider's web or horse's mane, the residue of sheep's wool in the grasses near a fold where every summer of her girlhood hundreds nested. Since then, I've seen it for myself, their genius, how they transform the useless. I've seen plastics stripped and whittled into brilliant straw, and newspapers, the dates, the years, supporting the underweavings. 2. As tonight in our bed by the window, you brushed my hair to help me sleep, and clean the brush as my mother did, offering the nest to the updraft. I'd like to think it will be lifted as far as the river and catch in some white sycamore, or drift too light to sink into the shaded inlets, the bank moss, where small fish, frogs, and insects lay their eggs. Would this constitute an afterlife? The story goes that sailors, moored for weeks off islands they called paradise, stood in the early sunlight cutting their hair. And the rare birds there, nameless, almost extinct, came down around them and cleaned the decks and disappeared into the trees above the sea. Deborah Diggs, Vesper Sparrows. I'm going to read you one more from this collection. This one is called The Transmigration of Souls. Inside the starboard window of his room in a boat at sea, the piece of earth he scraped from a dead gull's leg sprouts 80 different species, green under bell glass. By the sunlight of the oil lamp, he makes rain as the wind picks up toward Chilo, Port Famine, Concepcion, and then Galapagos. Here he finds shipwrecked sailors' epitaphs cut into the shell of an old tortoise who's tame enough to ride, too huge to slaughter. Here the birds are fearless. He can catch them with his hands, let them perch on his finger before he breaks their necks and wraps them in his shirt and sets their eggs on branches drifting from the shoreline, island to island. Now, everywhere he meets himself. He's tired and half the world from home, but his mind has entered the morning the way all the animals kept in his cabin in jars along the wall grow smaller in sequence until the window opens on the sea, so that what he'll remember are the wasted spaces, the desert rocks spread out for miles as if the earth were flat again, dangerous at the horizon, where the stones, piled, shine against lava black. Dew pools in the evenings, a few pale leaves appear. So that's from Deborah Diggs' Vesper Sparrows. Lovely collection all through. All right, so I'm going to read you a couple of my own. These poems are from the manuscript I'm currently working on now, which is all poems that have to do with the Anthropocene age and climate change and sort of our interactions with the environment and flora and fauna, endangered species, etc. So I'm going to read you just a handful of these. The first is called Vanishing, and it takes a little epigraph from the New York Times from this past September, which reads, "Nearly 1/3 of the wild birds in the United States and Canada have vanished since 1970, a staggering loss that suggests the very fabric of North America's ecosystem is unraveling." So this is Vanishing. As the world's cities teem with children, flooding our concrete terrains with shouts and signs, as the younglings balance scribbled earths above their heads, stand in blistering sun or unseasonal rain, the birds quietly lessen themselves among the grasslands. No longer a chorus, but a lonely indicating trill. Eastern meadowlark, wood thrush, indigo bunting, their voices ghosts in the chemical landscape of crops. Red-winged blackbirds veer beyond the veil. Orioles and swallows, the horned lark and the jay. Color drains from our common home so gradually we convince ourselves it has always been gray. Little hollow-boned dinosaurs, you who survived the last extinction, whose variety-obsessed scientific minds, whose bodies in the air compel our own bodies to spread and yearn, how we have failed you. The grackles are right to scold us as they feast on our garbage and genetically modified corn. Our children flock into the streets with voices raised, their anger a grim substitute for song. All right, and then I'm going to read you three little, the poems in this manuscript. There's poems like the ones I just read to you, and then interspersed among all of those are what I'm calling the Anthropocene blessings, and they're all little blessings and profiles of a variety of different endangered species. So I'm just going to read you three of those. They're very short. The most Darwin of them that I could muster up. So this is Anthropocene blessing, marine iguana. Blunt-snouted one, basking your crested spine, your copper-mottled hide in the Galapagos heat. Salt sneezer, algae eater, long-clawed lava clinger. May your soil-nested eggs be safe from alien dogs. May oil never slick your tidal zones. May all who crawl upon you, lava lizards, crabs, mockingbirds, and finches, the fish who clean your molting skin, be ever nourished. As the ocean rises, may it deter we who invade with our pathogens and tourist hands. May your saltwater colonies lounge in warm heaps on the rocks, coexist with the coalescent sun. All right. This is Anthropocene blessing, monarch butterfly. Milkweed, common tiger, wanderer, you of the poison-filled body, citrine hues of your wings framed in obsidian, flutter of stained glass membranes alighting on asters, thistles, goldenrod. May your banded instars devour their white-sapped hosts, antelope horn, heartleaf, woolly, whorled. May you find on your long migration every way station, each garden clumsily raised by human hands. May you overwinter free of herbicides from our modified, resistant crops. May you not fly headlong into our windshields and grills. May your singular pearly eggs shelter on the undersides of soft-furred leaves, survive to pupate, jay-hang, shed their chrysalis-revealing skins. May your metamorphosis be a lesson for we who are slow to change, we who cannot seem to figure how to create something beautiful from the dissolution we have made. Right. And one more, Anthropocene blessing, sea turtle. You of the precious scooted carapace, your mosaic flippers crescenting the water as you dive for jellyfish and decapods, creatures of abundant tentacles and many legs. You who mow the seagrass carpeting the ocean floor, who carry your breath along the tourmaline beds. May your serrated beak never know plastic or bycatch, never press against the thalidomide weave of nets. When you haul ashore, may you snow angel the sand for your clutch. May your soft-shelled eggs huddle unnoticed, untouched. May your untended hatchlings outrun every seabird and fox. May the reptilian pools of their eyes be graced by darkness, save the glowing wave line that beckons them from nest to ocean's tug. May their fleeing shells upend the night. So that's from the, actually it does have a name, but it's a secret name, my brand new manuscript that I'm working on now. So I'm going to end with reading you the first chapter of this novel, technically children's lit, YA I guess, but I think this book's for everybody. It's called The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate by Jacqueline Kelly. And the first chapter of this book is one of the most beautiful chapters of any book I've ever read. It's one of my very favorite first chapters of anything. So, The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate. Chapter 1. The Origin of Species. When a young naturalist commences the study of a group of organisms quite unknown to him, he is at first much perplexed to determine what differences to consider, for he knows nothing of the amount and kind of variation to which the group is subject. By 1899, we had learned to tame the darkness, but not the Texas heat. We arose in the dark, hours before sunrise, when there was barely a smudge of indigo along the eastern sky, and the rest of the horizon was still pure pitch. We lit our kerosene lamps and carried them before us in the dark like our own tiny wavering suns. There was a full day's work to be done before noon, when the deadly heat drove everyone back into our big shuttered house, and we lay down in the dim, high-ceilinged rooms like sweating victims. Mother's usual summer remedy of sprinkling the sheets with refreshing cologne lasted only a minute. At 3 o'clock of the afternoon, when it was time to get up again, the temperature was still killing. The heat was a misery for all of us in Fentress, but it was the women who suffered the most in their corsets and petticoats. I was still a few years too young for this uniquely feminine form of torture. They loosened their stays and sighed the hours away and cursed the heat and their husbands too for dragging them to Caldwell County to plant cotton and acres of pecan trees. Mother temporarily gave up her hair pieces, a crimped false fringe and a rolled horsehair rat, platforms on which she daily constructed an elaborate mountain of her own hair. On those days when we had no company, she even took to sticking her head under the kitchen pump and letting Viola, our quadroon cook, pump away until she was soaking through. We were forbidden by sharp orders to laugh at this astounding entertainment. As Mother gradually surrendered her dignity to the heat, we discovered, as did Father, that it was best to keep out of her way. My name is Calpurnia Virginia Tate, but back then everybody called me Callie V. That summer I was 11 years old and the only girl out of 7 children. Can you imagine a worse situation? I was spliced midway between 3 older brothers, Harry, Sam Houston, and Lamar, and 3 younger brothers, Travis, Sol Ross, and the baby, Jim Bowie, whom we called JB. The little boys actually managed to sleep at midday, sometimes even piled atop one another like damp, steaming puppies. The men who came in from the fields and my father, back from his office at the cotton gin, slept too, first dousing themselves with tin buckets of tepid well water on the sleeping porch before falling down on their rope beds as if poleaxed. Yes, the heat was a misery, but it also brought me my freedom. While the rest of the family tossed and dozed, I secretly made my way to the San Marcos riverbank and enjoyed a daily interlude of no school, no pestiferous brothers, and no mother. I didn't have permission to do this exactly, but no one said I couldn't. I got away with it because I had my own room at the far end of the hall, whereas my brothers all had to share, and they would have tattled in a red-hot second. As far as I could tell, this was the sole decent thing about being the only girl. Our house was separated from the river by a crescent-shaped parcel of 5 acres of wild, uncleared growth. It would have been an ordeal to push my way through it, except that the regular river patrons, dogs, deer, brothers, kept a narrow path beaten down through the treacherous sticker burrs that rose as high as my head and snatched at my hair and pinafore as I folded myself narrow to slide by. When I reached the river, I stripped down to my chemise, floating on my back with my shimmy gently billowing around me in the mild currents, luxuriating in the coolness of the water flowing around me. I was a river cloud, turning gently in the eddies. I looked up at the filmy bags of webworms high above me in the lush canopy of oaks bending over the river. The webworms seemed to mirror me, floating in their own balloons of gauze in the pale turquoise sky. That summer, all the men except for my grandfather, Walter Tate, cut their hair close and shaved off their thick beards and mustaches. They looked as naked as blind salamanders for the few days it took to get over the shock of their pale, weak chins. Strangely, Grandfather felt no distress from the heat, even with his full white beard tumbling down his chest. He claimed it was because he was a man of regular and moderate habits who never took whiskey before noon. His smelly old swallowtail coat was hopelessly outdated by then, but he wouldn't hear of parting with it. Despite regular spongings with benzene at the hands of our maid San Juana, the coat always kept its musty smell and strange color, which was neither black nor green. Grandfather lived under the same room with us, but was something of a shadowy figure. He had long since turned over the running of the family business to his only son, my father, Alfred Tate, and spent his days engaged in experiments in his laboratory out back. The laboratory was just one old shed that had once been a part of the slave quarters. When he wasn't in the laboratory, he was either out hunting specimens or holed up with his moldering books in a dim corner of the library where no one dared disturb him. I asked Mother if I could cut off my hair, which hung in a dense swelter all the way down my back. She said no, she wouldn't have me running about like a shorn savage. I found this manifestly unfair, to say nothing of hot, so I devised a plan. Every week I would cut off an inch of my hair, just one stealthy inch, so that Mother wouldn't notice. She wouldn't notice because I would camouflage myself with good manners. When I took on the disguise of a polite young lady, I could often escape her closer scrutiny. She was usually swamped by the constant demands of the household and the ceaseless uproar of my brothers. You wouldn't believe the amount of chaos and commotion 6 brothers could create. Plus, the heat aggravated her crippling sick headaches, and she had to resort to a big spoonful of Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, known to be the best blood purifier for women. That night, I took a pair of embroidery scissors, and with great exhilaration and a pounding heart, cut off the first inch. I looked at the soft haystack of hair cupped in my palm. I was striding forth to greet my future in the shiny new century a few short months away. It seemed to me a great moment indeed. I slept poorly that night in fear of the morning. The next day, I held my breath coming down the stairs to breakfast. The pecan flapjacks tasted like cardboard, and do you know what happened? Absolutely nothing. No one noticed in the slightest. I was mightily relieved, but also thought, well, isn't that just like this family? In fact, no one noticed anything until 4 weeks and 4 inches went by, and our cook Viola gave me a hard look one morning, but she didn't say a word. It was so hot that for the first time in history, Mother left the candles of the chandelier unlit at dinner time. She even let Harry and me skip our piano lessons for 2 weeks, which was just as well. Harry sweated on the keys so that they turned hazy along the pattern of the minuet in G. Nothing Mother or San Juan tried could bring back the sheen to the ivory. Besides, our music teacher, Miss Brown, was ancient, and her decrepit horse had to pull her gig 3 miles from Prairie Lee. They would both likely collapse on the trip and have to be put down. On consideration, not such a bad idea. Father, on learning that we would miss our lessons, said, a good thing, too. A boy needs piano like a snake needs a hoop skirt. Mother didn't want to hear it. She wanted 17-year-old Harry, her oldest, to become a gentleman. She had plans to send him off to the university in Austin, 50 miles away when he turned 18. According to the newspaper, there were 500 students at the university, 17 of them well-chaperoned young ladies in a school of liberal arts, with a choice of music, English, or Latin. Father's plan was different. He wanted Harry to be a businessman and one day take over the cotton gin and the pecan orchards and join Freemasons as he had. Father apparently didn't think piano lessons were a bad idea for me, though, if he considered the matter at all. In late June, the Fentress indicator reported that the temperature was 106 degrees in the middle of the street outside the newspaper office. The paper did not mention the temperature in the shade. I wondered why not, as no one in his right mind spent more than a second in the sun, except to make smartly for the next patch of shadow, whether it be cast by tree or barn or plow horse. It seemed to me that the temperature in the shade would be a lot more useful to the citizens of our town. I labored over a letter to the editor pointing this out, and to my great amazement the paper published my letter the following week. To my family's greater amazement, it began to publish the temperature in the shade as well. Reading that it was only 98 in the shade somehow made us feel a bit cooler. There was a sudden surge in insect activity both inside the house and out. Grasshoppers rose in flocks beneath the horses' hooves. The fireflies came out in such great numbers that no one could remember a summer with a more spectacular show. Each evening, my brothers and I gathered on the front porch and held a contest to see who could spot the first flicker. There was a considerable excitement and honor in winning, especially after Mother took a scrap of blue silk from her sewing basket and cut out a fine medallion complete with long streamers. In between headaches, she embroidered Fentress Firefly Prize on it in gold floss. It was an elegant and much coveted prize. The winner kept it until the following night. Ants invaded the kitchen as never before. They marched in military formation through minute cracks along the baseboards and windows and headed straight for the sink. They were desperate for water and would not be stopped. Viola took up arms against them to no avail. We deemed the fireflies a bounty and the ants a plague, but it occurred to me for the first time to question why there should be such a distinction. They were all just creatures trying to survive the drought, as we were. I thought Viola should give up and leave them alone, but I reconsidered after discovering that the black pepper in the egg salad was not pepper at all. While certain insects overran us, some of the other normal inhabitants of our property, such as earthworms, disappeared. My brothers complained about the lack of worms for fishing and the difficulty of digging for them in the hard, parched ground. Perhaps you've wondered, can earthworms be trained? I'm here to tell you that they can. The solution seemed obvious to me. The worms always came when it rained, and it was easy enough to make some rain for them. I carried a tin bucket of water to a shaded area in the 5 acres of scrub and dumped it on the ground in the same place a couple of times a day. After 4 days, I only had to show up with my bucket, and the worms, drawn by my footsteps and the promise of water, crawled to the surface. I scooped them up and sold them to Lamar for a penny a dozen. Lamar nagged me to tell him where I found them, but I wouldn't. However, I did confess my method to Harry, my favorite, from whom I could keep nothing. Well, almost nothing. "Callie V," he said, "I've got something for you." He went to his bureau and took out a pocket-sized red leather notebook with "Souvenir of Austin" stamped on the front. "Look here," he said, "I've never used it. You can use it to write down your scientific observations. You're a regular naturalist in the making." What exactly was a naturalist? I wasn't sure, but I decided to spend the rest of my summer being one. If all it meant was writing about what you saw around you, I could do that. Besides, now that I had my own place to write things down, I saw things I'd never noticed before. My first recorded notes were of the dogs. Due to the heat, they lay so still in the dirt as to look dead. Even when my younger brothers chivied them with sticks out of boredom, they wouldn't bother to raise their heads. They got up long enough to slurp at the water trough and then flopped down again, raising puffs of dust in their shallow hollows. You couldn't have rousted Ajax, father's prize bird dog, with a shotgun let off a foot in front of his muzzle. He lay with his mouth lolling open and let me count his teeth. In this way, I discovered that the roof of a dog's mouth is deeply ridged in a backwards direction down his gullet, in order no doubt to encourage the passage of struggling prey in one direction only, namely that of dinner. I wrote this in my notebook. I observed that the expressions of a dog's face are mainly manifested by the movement of his eyebrows. I wrote, "Why do dogs have eyebrows? Why do dogs need eyebrows?" I asked Harry, but he didn't know. He said, "Go ask grandfather, he knows that sort of thing." But I wouldn't. The old man had fierce, tufty eyebrows of his own, rather like a dragon's, and he was altogether too imposing a figure for me to have clambered on as an infant. He had never spoken to me directly that I remembered, and I wasn't entirely convinced he knew my name. Next, I turned my attention to the birds. For some reason, we had a great number of cardinals about the place that year. Harry tickled me when he said we had a fine crop of them, as if we had something to do with that number, as if we had labored to harvest their bright, cheerful bodies and placed them in the trees along our gravel drive like Christmas ornaments. But because there were so many, and the drought had cut down on their normal diet of seeds and berries, the males squabbled furiously over possession of each hackleberry tree. I found a mutilated dead male in the brush, a startling and sad sight. Then one morning a female came to perch on the back of the wicker chair next to me on the porch. I froze. I could have reached out and touched her with my finger. A lump of gray-brown matter dangled from her pale apricot beak. It looked like a tiny baby mouse, thimble-sized, dead or dying. When I related this at dinner, Father said, "Calpurnia, cardinals do not eat mice. They live on vegetation. Sam Houston, please pass the potatoes." "Yes, well, I'm just telling you, sir," I said lamely, and then felt furious with myself for not having defended what I'd seen with my own eyes. The thought of the cardinals, driven to such unnatural behavior, repelled me. The next step would be cannibalism. Before I went to bed that night, I took a canful of oats from the stable and dribbled them along the drive. I wrote in my notebook, "How many cardinals will we have next year with not enough to eat? Remember to count." I next wrote in my notebook that we had 2 very different kinds of grasshoppers that summer. We had the usual quick little emerald ones, decorated all over with black speckles, and then there were huge bright yellow ones, twice as big, and torpid, so waxy and fat that they bowed down grasses when they landed. I'd never seen these before. I pulled everyone in the house, except Grandfather, to find out where these odd yellow specimens had come from, but nobody could tell me. None of them was the slightest bit interested. As a last resort, I rounded up my courage and went out to my grandfather's laboratory. I pushed back the burlap flap that served as a door and stood quaking on the threshold. He looked up in surprise from the counter where he was pouring a foul-looking brown liquid into various beakers and retorts. He didn't invite me in. I stumbled through my grasshopper conundrum while he stared at me as if he was having trouble placing me. "Oh," he said mildly, "I suspect that a smart young whip like you can figure it out. Come back and tell me when you have." He turned away from me and began to write in his ledger. So that was that. My audience with the dragon. I counted it a wash. On the one hand, he hadn't breathed fire at me, but on the other, he'd been no help at all. Perhaps if I'd made Harry go with me, Grandfather would have accorded me more attention. Maybe he was peeved that I'd interrupted his work, although he had spoken to me in polite tones. I knew that he was working on what he was working on. For some reason, he'd gotten into his head to figure a way to distill pecans into whiskey. He apparently reasoned that if you could make fine spirits from common corn and the lowly potato, why not the princely pecan? And, Lord knows, we were drowning in pecans, 60 acres of them. I went back to my room and contemplated the grasshopper puzzle. I had one of the small green grasshoppers in a jar in my vanity, and I stared at it for inspiration. I had been unable to catch one of the big yellow ones, even though they were much slower. "Why are you different?" I asked, but it refused to answer. The next morning, I awoke as usual to a scuffling in the wall next to my bed. It was a possum returning to his lair at the normal time. Shortly after this, I heard the slap and slam of sash weights as San Juana threw open the parlor windows beneath my room. I sat up in my high brass bed, and suddenly it came to me that the fat yellow grasshoppers had to be an entirely new species, separate and apart from the green ones, and that I, Calpurnia Virginia Tate, had discovered them. And didn't the discoverer of a brand new species get to put her name on it? I was going to be famous. My name would be heralded far and wide, the governor would shake my hand, the university would award me a diploma. But what do I do now? How did I stake my claim in the natural world? I had a vague idea that I had to write to someone to register my find, some official in Washington. I'd heard debates at the dinner table between my grandfather and our minister, Mr. Barker, concerning Mr. Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, and the dinosaurs they were unearthing in Colorado, and what this meant to the book of Genesis. They talked about how nature weeded out the weak and left the hardy to carry on. Our schoolteacher, Miss Harbottle, had glossed over Mr. Darwin, looking discomfited as she did so. Surely such a book addressing the origin of species would tell me what to do. But how on earth could I get my hands on it when controversy still raged about such matters in our corner of the world? There was even an active chapter of the Flat Earth Society in San Antonio. Then I remembered that Harry was due to take the long bed wagon into Lockhart for supplies. Lockhart was the seat of Caldwell County. The county library was there. Books were there. All I had to do was beg a ride from Harry, the one brother who could deny me nothing. In Lockhart, after conducting our business, Harry loitered on the corner so he could admire the figures of the ladies strolling by, exhibiting their latest finery from the local milliner. I mumbled excuses and slipped across the courthouse square. The library was cool and dark. I walked up to the counter where the elderly lady librarian was handing some books to a fat man in a white linen suit. Then it was my turn. Just at that moment, a woman with a little boy came up. It was Mrs. Ogletree and her 6-year-old Georgie. Georgie and I shared the same piano teacher, and his mother knew my mother. Oh, no. The last thing I wanted was a witness. "Good afternoon, Callie," she said. "Is your mother here today?" "She's at home, Mrs. Ogletree. Hello, Georgie." "Hi, Callie," he said. "What are you doing here?" Just looking at books. Here, you've got yours. You go ahead of me, please." I stepped back and grandly waved them forward. "Why, thank you, Callie," she said. "Such lovely manners. I shall have to mention it to your mother next time I see her." After an eternity, they left. I kept glancing around to see if anyone else was about to come up. The librarian frowned at me. I stepped up to the counter and whispered, "Please, ma'am, do you have a copy of Mr. Darwin's book?" She leaned over the counter and said, "What was that?" "Mr. Darwin's book. You know, The Origin of Species." She frowned and cupped a hand behind her ear. "You have to speak up." I spoke up in a shaking voice. "Mr. Darwin's book. That one. Please." She pinioned me with a sour look and said, "I most certainly do not. I wouldn't keep such a thing in my library. They keep a copy at the Austin Library, but I would have to order it by post. That's 50 cents. Do you have 50 cents? "No, ma'am." I could feel myself turning pink. I'd never had 50 cents in my life. "And," she added, "I would need a letter from your mother, permitting you to read that particular book. Do you have such a letter?" "No, ma'am," I said, mortified. My neck was starting to itch, the telltale precursor to an outbreak of hives. She sniffed. "I thought not. Now I have books to be shelved. You must excuse me." I wanted to weep with rage and humiliation, but I refused to cry in front of the old bat. I left the library in a purple froth and found Harry lounging in front of the general store. He looked at me with concern. I scratched the welts that had popped up on my neck and yelled, "What is the point of a library if they won't give you a book?" Harry glanced around. "What are you talking about?" "Some people aren't fit to be librarians," I said. "I want to go home now." On the long, hot, silent trip back in the wagon, piled high with goods, Harry looked over at me. "What's the matter, my own pet?" "Nothing," I snapped. Oh, absolutely nothing, except that I was strangling on bitterness and gall and was in no mood to talk about it. For once I was glad of the privacy of the deep sunbonnet that Mother made me wear to prevent freckling. "Do you know what's in that crate?" Harry said. "The one right behind you?" I didn't bother to reply. I didn't know and I didn't care. I hated the world. "It's a wind machine," he said, "for Mother." If it had been any of my other brothers, I would have snarled at him, "Don't be ridiculous, there's no such thing." "Really it is," he said. "You'll see." When we got home, I couldn't stand the noisy excitement at the unloading of the wagon. I bolted for the river. I ripped off my bonnet and pinafore and dress and threw myself into the water, casting terror into the hearts of the local tadpoles and turtles. Good. That lady librarian had ruined my day, and I was determined to ruin someone or something else's day. I ducked my head under water and let out a long, loud scream, the sound burbling in my ears. I came up for air and did it again, and one more time just to be thorough. The cooling water gradually soothed me. After all, what was one book to me? Really, it didn't matter. One day I would have all the books in the world, shelves and shelves of them. I would live my life in a tower of books. I would read all day long and eat peaches. And if any young knights in armor dared to come calling on their white chargers and plead with me to let down my hair, I would pelt them with peach pits until they went home. I lay on my back and watched a pair of swallows racing up and down the river, tumbling like acrobats in pursuit of invisible bugs. Despite my hours of freedom, the summer was not proceeding as I had envisaged. Nobody was interested in the questions that I wrote in my notebook. Nobody was interested in helping me figure out the answers. The heat sapped the life out of everybody and everything. I thought of our beloved big old house and how sad it looked in the middle of the yellow, dried-out lawn. Usually the grass was soft and cool and green, inviting you to take off your boots and run across it barefoot and play statues. But now it was a scorched bright gold and as menacing to the feet as straw stubble. The yellow grass made it hard to see my brand new species of big yellow grasshopper. You couldn't find them until you practically stepped on them. Then they would zing upward and fly ponderously on clacking wings for a few feet and disappear in the grass again. Catching them was difficult, despite their being fat and slow. Funny how the smaller and quicker emerald ones were such a snap to catch. They were just too easy to spot. The birds spent their days gobbling them up, while the yellow ones hid nearby and taunted their less fortunate brothers. And then I understood. There was no new species. They were all one kind of grasshopper. The ones that were born a bit yellower to begin with lived to an old age in the drought. The birds couldn't see them in the parched grass. The greener ones, the ones the birds picked off, didn't last long enough to grow big. Only the yellower ones survived because they were more fit to survive the torrid weather. Mr. Charles Darwin was right. The proof lay in my own front yard. I lay in shock in the water thinking about this, staring at the sky, looking for some flaw in my reasoning, some crack in my conclusion. I could find none. Then I splashed my way to the bank. I hauled myself out by some handy elephant ears, dried off with my pinafore, dressed as fast as I could, and ran home. When I got back to the house, I found the whole family clustered around a busted open crate in the hallway. In the middle of the Excelsior nest sat a squat black metal machine with 4 blades on the front and a glass reservoir on the back into which my father poured kerosene. In the middle of the blades, a round brass boss proclaimed in curly script, "Chicago's finest wind machine." Father said, "Stand back." He struck a match and set the thing alight. It filled the room with a mineral stink and a great whoosh of air. My brothers all cheered. I cheered too, but for a different reason. Life in the house got somewhat easier after that. Mother retired at midday with her wind machine, and all our lives got better, especially Father's, whom she sometimes invited to retire with her. It took me a week to get up the nerve to visit Grandfather again. He was sitting in his laboratory on a dilapidated armchair, the oozing, stuffing mind by mice. I said, "I know why the big grasshoppers are yellow and why the little ones are green." I told him my discovery and how I'd figured it out. I shifted from foot to foot as he looked at me and listened in silence. After a while he said, "Did you come up with this on your own? With no help?" "Yes," I said, and then I told him about my humiliating trip to the Lockhart Library. He stared at me for a moment with an odd expression on his face, perhaps surprise, perhaps consternation, as if I were a species he'd never seen before, and he said, "Come with me." He didn't speak a word as we walked to the house. Oh dear, I had done the unthinkable not once but twice by interrupting him at his work. Was he going to turn me over to Mother for yet another lecture on good manners? He led me into the library where we children were not supposed to go. So he was going to deliver the lecture himself. Perhaps he would berate me for my clumsy theory, or perhaps he would switch me across the hands. My dread grew. Who was I, Callie V. Tate of Fentress, Texas, to think I could even contemplate such matters? A nobody from nowhere. Despite my fear, I took a good look around the room, since I knew I'd never have the chance again. The library was dim, even with the heavy bottle green velvet drapes drawn back from the tall double window. Right by the window sat a huge leather armchair and a spool table holding a lamp for reading. There were books on the floor by the chair, and more books stacked in tall wooden shelves made from our failed pecan trees. You couldn't escape the enduring fact of pecans in our lives. There was a large oak desk covered in intriguing oddities, a blown ostrich egg on a carved wooden stand, a microscope nesting in a shagreen leather case, a carved whale's tooth etched with a bosomy lady not exactly contained by her corset. The family Bible and a huge dictionary with its own magnifying glass lay side by side next to a red plush album full of cramped formal portraits of my ancestors. So, would I be getting the Bible lecture or the letting down my ancestors lecture? I waited while he made up his mind. I glanced around the walls, which were covered with shallow boxes displaying alarming stick insects and bright multicolored butterflies. Below each gay scrap of color was a scientific name in my grandfather's careful copperplate script. I forgot myself and went over to peer at them. Bear, said Grandfather. Huh? I thought. Watch the bear, he said, just as I tripped on the open, sneering mouth of a black bearskin rug, its fangs a trap in the gloom for the unwary. Right, bear, sir. Grandfather unthreaded his watch chain to remove a tiny key. He unlocked a tall glass cabinet crammed with more books, preserved birds, bottled beasts, and other curios. I sidled over to get a better look at this irresistible display. A misshapen armadillo caught my eye, warped and buckled and lumpy, obviously stuffed by the most inept amateur. Why did he have that? I could have done better. Next to it was a 5-gallon specimen bottle of thick glass containing the strangest beast I had ever seen. A thick, blobby form, multiple arms, 2 big glaring eyes distorted by the glass into huge saucer orbs, the stuff of nightmares. What on earth was it? I drew closer. Grandfather reached into the stack of books. I saw Dante's Inferno next to the Science of Hot Air Ballooning. There was a study of mammalian reproduction and a treatise on drawing the female nude. He extracted a book covered in rich green Morocco leather, handsomely tipped with gold. He polished it with his sleeve, although I could see no dust on it. Ceremoniously, he bowed and offered it to me. I looked at it. The Origin of Species. Here in my own house. I received it in both my hands. He smiled. Thus began my relationship with Granddaddy. So that is the first chapter of The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate by Jacqueline Kelly, which is just an astonishingly gorgeous story. So, thanks for tuning in tonight to Some of Each, The Origin of Species. We heard tonight from Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer, Deborah Diggs' Vesper, Sparrows, and The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate by Jacqueline Kelly. And if you like any of these books, I urge you to support your local bookstores and order them online or for curbside pickup in these difficult times. And thanks for sitting with me and reading tonight. And get back to reading yourself. Good night, everyone.